December 23, 1994, South Boston, Massachusetts. The snow fell in bruised cheeks that seemed to swallow the skyline whole, muting the city to a hush that felt like a warning, while a third-floor walk-up on a narrow Southie street framed the silhouette of a man who'd mastered the art of outwaiting fate. Down the block, an unmarked Bureau sedan idled beneath a failing street lamp, its windows fogged by nervous breath and the tired hope that tonight might be different, that the myth named Whitey would stop being a rumor and become a man. Somewhere else in the city, a phone rang, and in the space between two words traveled a message with the weight of a verdict. A grand jury was coming. Indictments were real. The ice under his boots had cracked at last. He did not tremble. He stacked cash in elastic-throttled bricks, chamber-checked a pistol that had outlived its paperwork, and passed family photos that knew better than to speak. He closed the door softly because he understood that noise draws eyes, and eyes draw endings. Out in the storm, South Boston swallowed his footprints as if it knew how to keep a secret. But it wasn't just the city helping. It was the country, too. The institution with the seal and the files and the habit of calling a butcher informant when the butcher brought the right carcasses. What the snow covered that night would thaw years later. That the FBI's most wanted man had lived for decades in the brittle warmth of protection. That the ledger of favors had a body count. That some of the dead were collateral to a strategy with its own anthem and its own amnesia. He would become a ghost in the places he loved. The dock's iron breath, the bar's amber gloom, the alleys that knew the language of thunder and learned to tell gunfire from weather. And when he finally returned, he would be a chains rattle in a courtroom, a face on television gone smaller under fluorescent lights, a myth shorn of the glamour that only time can lend. Still, the twist had always been welded to the bones of this story. The most wanted, who fed from the same hand that hunted him. The city that learned to talk around a secret, and the country that could not decide whether it was purging evil or managing it.
He was born September 3, 1929, the year the market broke and took the country to its knees. And he grew up in Old Harbor Village, where the wind off Dorchester Bay salted the air, and the shipyards hammered out a rhythm that taught you when to square your shoulders and when to duck. They called him Whitey for hair too pale for a neighborhood that prized darkness, and he learned early that a nickname could be a leash if you let it. He didn't. South Boston was an education in loyalty and silence, in the kind of family that started with blood and continued with whoever showed up when the siren wailed. He came of age in the shadow of a world war that swallowed names off stoops and returned only folded flags. And for boys who didn't cross the ocean, the streets became a kind of front line, corners contested, debts paid in knuckles and hours in holding cells. The uniform called to him for reasons that had nothing to do with flag waving. The Air Force offered a code of respectability you could wear like armor, and it taught him the tempo of institutions, how they speak softly when they think they own you, how their voices harden when you step out of the script, how silence can be a weapon in close quarters. The stockade knew his name even as the discharge paper stamped honorable, contradictions that would become the architecture of his life. Two truths leaning on each other until neither fell. When he came home, the boy with a bone-deep memory of cold had learned to keep his face still and his options moving. He didn't yet know that the country's laboratories had plans for him, that the next set of walls would not be barracks but penitentiaries, and that the most ruthless experiments he'd carry out would be the ones someone else started inside his head.
The decade wore chrome and hope in the suburbs. But his America ran on getaway cars and teller cages. When the law caught up, the sentence was federal and long, an archipelago of punishment that ferried him from Atlanta to Alcatraz to Leavenworth to Lewisburg. If the streets had taught him hunger, prison taught him patience, the art of waiting with a pulse you couldn't see. In Atlanta, he volunteered for something sold as science, helping the fight against madness, and found instead measured drops of LSD, MK Ultra in everything with signature, a careful unknitting of reality by men with pens who promised secrecy the way a wolf promises peace to lambs. He remembered ceilings that moved and edges that frayed, remembered the sensation that someone else was turning the dials inside his skull, that the borders of self could be shifted like a fence on a foggy morning. What do you learn when your mind becomes a laboratory? He learned to trust nothing, least of all his own memory. Learned that reality could be engineered, and so could loyalty. That paper could lose its truth behind black bars of redaction, and that officials could tuck atrocities into footnotes and call them anomalies. After 9 years, he walked out with a face that had learned stillness and a heart that had learned arithmetic. Crime done correctly was not a storm of chaos, but a ledger with predictable rain. South Boston had different bosses now, but the dialect remained ancient. Favors, fear, funerals, and he was fluent in all 3 languages. He had also learned a new faith. Institutions bend, people break. If you can turn a mind into a maze, you can push a city the same way and collect at every corner.
Street Wars and Winter Hill, 1970s. You cannot return to a city, you only meet its new version, and the one he met wore 2 surnames like rival flags, Killeen and Mullen, a civil war of corners and docks where righteousness was never on the ballot and profit was the only referendum that counted. He aligned with the Killeens and then with survival, learning that bullets decide less than phone calls do, that handshakes can be treaties or traps, and that sometimes the most merciful burial is the one the snowplow won't find until spring. The blood ran and the city barely blinked, because South Boston knew the vocabulary of thunder and could tell storm from gunfire by the way the dogs flinched. Peace came only as consolidation. You didn't stop violence so much as put it under new management. With Howie Winter and Somerville, the Winter Hill crew dressed their ambition in clean shirts and quiet cars, and Stephen, the Rifleman Flemmi, brought a velvet calm to the kind of decisions that end in basements. Racetracks became printing presses for money, easier to fix than cops, cleaner on the books, and when indictments swept up Howie for race fixing, Whitey and Flemmi didn't trip. They stepped over the rubble and kept walking, the hill becoming theirs as naturally as gravity. The city adjusted, as cities do, to a new king with a smile that never touched his eyes, to a tax called protection, to a rumor that would one day mature into evidence, that the badge and the blade were beginning to eat at the same table. The Deal with the Devil, mid-1970s to 1980s. John Connolly of the Boston FBI, Southie-born and fluent in the parish where ambition and loyalty share a pew, approached with an offer elegant enough to be mistaken for Providence. Help us take down the Italians, the Patriarca family, and we'll look kindly on Winter Hill. In Washington, it translated as top echelon informant, in South Boston as untouchable, and in Whitey's head as a tailor-made invisibility cloak. Proximity made the pitch sing. Connolly and his colleague John Morris could talk like cousins at a funeral, promise favors that sounded like home more than law, and accept gifts as if corruption were simply another way of staying close to the action. Money crossed tables, so did information. Envelopes grew heavy, consciences got lighter, and the Bureau watched its evidence boards blossom with victories against the rival mob, while a different weed grew under the wallpaper. Winter Hill unchallenged, unhurried, unafraid. On paper, it looked immaculate, a courageous informant helping sterilize organized crime. In practice, it was a butcher coaching the inspector where to condemn, a scoreboard that glowed bright while the morgue filled quietly. Ask the dead about justice.
Brian Halloran, who warned the FBI that Bulger had murdered a businessman, mowed down on a waterfront road alongside Michael Donahue, a father of 3 who offered him a ride. John Callahan, tied to World High Ally, found murdered in Miami. Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey, women close enough to hear the truth whisper. John McIntyre, an IRA gunrunner who talked to authorities and vanished into a basement with a single hanging bulb and no exit. The Bureau would later say it did not know, or did not know enough, or did not know in time. Bureaucracy's lullaby for the bereaved, while on the street, the rumor hardened into policy. Whitey was protected. The line between badge and blade blurred until the city saw only a single hand holding both.
Ascension without mercy. Late 1970s, early 1990s. When Howie Winter fell to indictments, the vacuum lasted less than a breath. Power abhors emptiness, and Bulger and Flemmi were already holding the keys. Kevin Weeks became the fist at the end of their arm, a stocky guardian who moved cash like sacrament and threats like weather, reading Whitey the way sailors read a sky minutes before lightning. South Boston turned into a company town where the company sold fear, protection as taxation, silence as currency, and interest rates written in bruises. In private, violence kept a ritual schedule. Basements with cement floors that kept secrets, garages where trunks yawned wider than mouths, and shovels that worked overtime under the hum of distant Christmas lights. Even as bodies disappeared into the city's cold soil, the FBI's files grew fat with triumphs against rival families, wiretaps, raids, headlines, an immaculate scoreboard that framed Winter Hill's expansion as a civic service. But favors have due dates, and by the early 1990s, good men trapped inside bad machines began to ask worse questions. Grand juries do not speak with accents, and the federal calendar started circling dates in a patient red. Somewhere in a windowless room, an indictment list lengthened like a winter night. And so we returned to the storm, to a December door closing without a bang, to the figure that the city would not see again for 17 years, to a vanishing not performed in panic but in muscle memory. Because when you've taught yourself to be a ghost, all disappearance is rehearsal.
The Long Disappearance, 1995 to 2011. America learned his face from posters and prime-time segments, a glare reproduced so many times it became less a portrait than a sigil, while he slipped through the country like a rumor wearing new shoes. New Orleans, San Diego, Chicago, each sighting an almost, each motel a lesson in how to leave no fingerprints on a sunrise. He didn't hide in wilderness, but in routine. Santa Monica's salt air replaced Boston's diesel stink, but silence travels well. And as Charlie Gasco, he blended into a beige apartment with tidy blinds and walls that held things they weren't supposed to hold, guns wrapped like sleeping dogs, and $822,000 in cash stacked like sealed testimony. Catherine Greig, loyal, meticulous, fed strays, visited salons, lived the kind of life that makes neighbors think harmless. And a ghost needs nothing more than to be mistaken for a quiet couple behind a polite door. Back east, the FBI raised rewards and the volume. America's Most Wanted spoke his name like a prayer shouted into storm surf. And in 2011, the Bureau turned the hunt sideways by spotlighting Catherine's orbit, cosmetic clinics, dental offices, the places where routine addresses itself. A neighbor recognized the face from a TV ad and told the truth to a phone. The plan outside that coastal building was simple and therefore difficult. Knock and be ready for anything. The garage door slid on its rails like a curtain, and when it closed, the myth looked suddenly smaller under fluorescent bulbs. No speech, no shootout, just cuffs and a wall cavity yawning open to reveal the old reliables, money, weapons, and time finally run dry. Headlines called it an ending. Boston asked if it was the beginning of something rougher, a reckoning with the years when a badge and a blade were two sides of the same coin.
The trial, 2013, Boston. Federal courtrooms are built to look permanent, temples where the marble pretends truth is a tenant, and when he entered in chains, the myth strained under gravity. People didn't see a ghost anymore. They saw a man carved from anger, control, and an old loathing for the word rat, an irony that sat in the gallery like an uninvited witness. He refused to testify, called the proceedings a sham when it suited him, and stared down former comrades who swapped oaths for microphones. Kevin Weeks, John Martorano, men who had breathed inside the storm, spoke in the calm rhythms of practiced confession while the jury did its arithmetic. Racketeering, extortion, money laundering, firearms, and murder. 19 charged, 11 proved. The families stood and turned their names into ballast. Halloran and Donahue, Davis and Hussey, Callahan and McIntyre, grief that outlives any bench's power, a litany that turned the courtroom's air heavy enough to bend light. The judge pronounced 2 life sentences plus 5 years, a mathematics of finality the system uses when it cannot return the dead. And still he offered no apology. He carried away the same secret he'd always guarded. How much of his kingdom had been built on fear and how much on favor from men with badges who thought strategy excused proximity. The chapter closed, but the book kept a page unturned, waiting for a prison that hadn't learned his name yet, and a hallway where debts get paid at last call.
The Last Transfer, October 2018, Hazleton. They moved him like freight through a system that confuses logistics with destiny. Florida to Oklahoma to West Virginia. Under fluorescent suns and nights that smelled like bleach. The paperwork reading like weather reports, and the decisions made in rooms that never meet daylight. Hazleton, Misery Mountain, had a reputation even rumors didn't exaggerate. And he arrived there in the small hours of October 30, 2018. By sunrise, he was dead. Beaten by fellow inmates in a place where ideology and grievance share cells and where some circles finally close. The Bureau of Prisons promised investigation, a word that fluttered like a loose page in a wind, while families heard the news and tried to understand whether justice had finally become a circle. Whether the man who outlived so many verdicts had found the only verdict that never misses. No one writes a myth to end in a hallway no one sees, but that's where myths often go. Under a sheet on a gurney, a case number in a database, and a ledger balanced by hands the legend never shook. The ghost gangster had been many things, but suddenly he was only what the state always said he was: property to be moved, a body to be logged, a story finishing in a place famous not for mercy, but for quantities of it withheld.
Boston wears its past like a scar under a suit. The Bulger years are raised welt you can trace with a finger. How close law and crime can stand without touching. How brotherhood can mean Beacon Hill for one Bulger and floorboards stained dark for another. How a city learns to breathe again after 2 decades of inhaling fear. Hollywood rolled tape, The Departed, Black Mass, because America loves villains brewed in local water. But the truth doesn't need a trailer, it needs names, and it needs a city willing to calculate exactly how a man like Whitey remained both hunter and protected species for so long. The FBI's reckoning came in court filings and public shame. John Connolly convicted, John Morris disgraced. Yet paper accountability can't exhume a single grave. South Boston keeps its maintenance through memory. Candles on simple stones, Irish flags folding under dusk, old men telling young ones what a favor will cost when it comes with a business card. History doesn't absolve, it remembers. And remembrance is a kind of work, one that demands we ask if the strategy that made headlines against the Patriarca family was worth the bodies that never got headlines at all. In the end, the legend of the ghost gangster is not just about a single man moving like smoke through an era. It's about the draft in the room that let him pass, institutions with shortcuts, neighborhoods with silences, and a country that must decide whether it wants safety clean or safety fast.
Voices of the Lost, the family's vigil. They came with photographs that could still warm a room, and with voices that had learned to hold steady while naming the dead. Mothers, sons, sisters, friends, stepping to the lectern to turn grief into sentences that courts could record and strangers could feel. In their stories, Brian Halloran laughed again. Michael Donahue drove again. Deborah Davis smiled in a borrowed summer. In their stories, John Callahan packed a suitcase, and John McIntyre dared to hope for forgiveness. In their stories, the vanished were refitted with ordinary moments, the way someone stirred coffee, the way a father put his hand on a shoulder. And the courtroom air thickened until even the judge's marble seemed to soften. No speech returns the dead, but naming is a form of rescue, a pulling back from the undertow of the record into the shallows where a community can touch its past without drowning in it. Candlelight vigils glowed in winter, and South Boston learned the discipline of maintenance. You visit, you say the name, you teach your children what power's invoice looks like when it is mailed to your house without warning. The microphones left when the verdicts were read. The families stayed, because grief is not an event, but a place, a neighborhood you maintain with memory. And in that quiet labor, a city found its moral center, not in the spectacle of a trial, but in the patient endurance of those who carry the cost long after the headlines fold. Brothers in Parallel: Politics, Power, and the Shadow. Long before the fugitive years, Boston had learned to pronounce the Bulger surname in two registers. William "Billy" Bulger, the consummate insider, state senate titan, later the university president, whose intelligence and discipline made him a pillar. And James "Whitey" Bulger, the street king who learned to turn fear into tax and favors into municipal policy conducted off-book. They were not the same man, and to confuse them was to misunderstand a city where power takes many shapes, but the parallel lines unnerved people. Law and order speaking in Latin on Beacon Hill, while law and order spoke a darker dialect in Southie basements. When Billy appeared before Congress in the early 2000s to explain his brother's calls and the choices one makes when blood and duty collide, the performance was Shakespearean and local at once, a loyalist's argument in a republic's chamber, a reminder that family is a country with its own constitution. The optics damaged him, resignation followed, and Boston found itself debating not just who had done what, but what shared childhood and shared streets mean when fate splits a house and sends its sons to opposite altars. The point isn't that politics enabled crime. The point is that proximity confuses us, that cities are built from overlapping loyalties, and that the same parish bells that bless a wedding ring can also ring for a funeral bought in cash. In this, the Bulger story is less an aberration than a map. Power without transparency breeds shadows, and shadows are where the city's worst bargains get signed.
The lie he lived by. He hated the word rat, wore the hatred like armor, and in the mythology he curated, loyalty was the only sacrament that mattered, so long as he defined it. But the files and the funerals tell a different liturgy. A man who traded intelligence for sanctuary, who fed rivals to a machine that stamped its paperwork justice, and who then insisted the ink did not spell his name. It is a peculiar American romance, the gangster who keeps his code pure, even as he breaks every bone around him. And in that romance, Whitey Bulger found an alibi that outlived his circumstances. He was not an informant, he maintained. The Bureau was a resource, not a master. His enemies were the only casualties that counted. But codes are mirrors, and this one cracked under the light of evidence. Memos, meetings, the inexorable arithmetic of who died and who thrived, until only the naked calculation remained. He believed himself an instrument of order in a world of chaos. The city learned he was a manufacturer of chaos in a world craving order. That is the final lesson, the one the alleys and courtrooms agree upon. Mythology is a luxury the dead do not get to purchase, and the word you fear most may be the one you already are. In the end, the legend is less about villainy than about the drift of institutions when strategy applauds results and forgets to ask the body count for its opinion.
Outro: The City and the Ghost. Boston carries on. Buses sigh at corners. The harbor breathes out salt. Parents walk children past stoops that remember. And in that ordinary motion lives the only real verdict a city can deliver: continuance. Whitey Bulger's story is not a parable with a tidy moral. It is a caution about bargains struck in the dark, about institutions that mistake ends for absolution, about neighborhoods that survive by deciding again and again to tell the truth about themselves even when the truth hurts. The ghost gangster is gone, reduced to case numbers, court transcripts, and a slab of history. But the shadow he cast is instructive. Safety purchased on the cheap is a bill that arrives late with interest. Power without scrutiny will always find a basement, and justice delayed is never justice denied for the dead, only for the living who must carry it. History remembers the victors, the famous, the names that turn into headlines. Boston remembers the graves and the candles and the people who speak them into light. If you were here until the end, you're part of history now. Subscribe for more stories the world tried to forget. Tell me in the comments, do you think this story could have ended differently?